Parliament on pause as British MPs reject yet another proposal for snap elections. Is this a tale of a government plan that backfired, was blundered or blocked? I'm Imran Garda and today's newsmaker is embattled Prime Minister Boris Johnson. If you've been struggling to keep up with the latest developments with Brexit, who could blame you? Each day brings a new twist to this British drama that many feel has dragged on for too many seasons. The deadline to leave the EU is looming, but Parliament has now been suspended, a tactic that had protesters shouting, "Stop the coup." MPs will not meet again until 2 weeks before the UK's scheduled departure. Now Johnson's job is to use this time to negotiate an exit deal with Brussels, something his predecessors couldn't achieve in years. But what other option does he have? Crash out with no deal? Well, that was rejected by Parliament. What about a snap election? No, that was blocked too. It made us stop and think, do we even know what the British public wants anymore? Haider Abbasi reports.
The Brexit beast has already consumed 2 prime ministers. Is it sniffing around for its next meal? Boris Johnson seems only able to watch as his government loses control. In 1 week, he's lost 6 votes in Parliament, tossed 21 MPs out of his party, and seen 2 of his ministers resign. Even a family member turned against him. His younger brother quit the cabinet, suggesting Johnson isn't acting in the national interest. But the Prime Minister is refusing to back down. He's determined to lead Britain out of the European Union by the deadline of October 31st, even if it means exiting without a deal.
Of course, we must get Brexit done, because the UK must come out on October the 31st, by October the 31st, or else I fear that permanent damage will be done in the UK to trust in our democratic system.
But it seems democracy is standing in his way.
Prime Minister.
In August, the Prime Minister decided to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks. The suspension began on Tuesday morning and will last until October the 14th. Many critics interpreted this as the government's way of trying to force through a no-deal Brexit without a debate. But Britain's opposition and even MPs from the ruling Conservatives have united to stop a no-deal Brexit. They passed a bill to block this from happening. The law also requires the Brexit deadline to be extended by 3 months if Johnson can't arrange a new withdrawal deal with the EU. Johnson says the only way out of the deadlock is a general election. He wants it to take place on October the 15th. But the opposition isn't having it, at least not without conditions.
When we're absolutely clear there's no crashing out on the 31st of October, let's go ahead and have the election so the people of this country can decide who they want to be their MP and who they want to be in government.
Johnson needs the support of 2/3 of Parliament to trigger an election, but he's already lost that vote twice. So what will he do next? And if the Prime Minister can't deliver Brexit as he promised, will he be forced to resign? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Brussels by Peter Wilding. He was an advisor to former Prime Minister David Cameron. He also coined the term Brexit. It's all his fault, and is now the chairman of the British influence think tank. In London is Claire Fox. She's a member of the European Parliament for the Brexit Party and was previously part of the UK's Revolutionary Communist Party. And Dominic Walsh is a policy analyst at Open Europe, a think tank focusing on the UK's relationship with the European Union. Good to have you all on the program. Dominic, let me start with you. So as we go to air, I'm hearing that Boris Johnson, as reported by Reuters, is saying that he's still confident that by October the 31st, he will have a deal with the EU and Britain will leave the European Union. What gives him such confidence, or is he talking nonsense?
Well, I think that's the only choice really available to him anymore, because he's shut down Parliament for 5 weeks, and then when Parliament returns, he has a really short window of 5 days until the 19th of October. And on that day, if Parliament has not either approved a deal or approve no deal, then the law that MPs passed this week says that he has to ask the EU for an extension. And he's made very clear that that he's not going to ask the EU for an extension, which some have interpreted as a kind of covert admission that he wants to break the law. Others have said that that means that he'll have no choice but to resign. But the third way really is to get a deal and pass it before the 19th of October. So I think it's more out of necessity than anything else that he's pushing this deal line now.
Peter Wilding, what should he do?
Well, actually, I believe he's got an incredible, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reshape politics. I mean, we are talking about procedural issues right now, but he knew and has known all along that he hasn't got the votes to carry anything in the House of Commons, let alone his agenda. His only way out was a general election. Now, the question is, how do you turn disadvantage to your advantage? And the tragedy of the situation is that Boris Johnson has got a fantastic, ready-made populist platform. I can see a situation where he resigns before having to seek an extension from the European Union. He then pitches, as he will do actually from now on, now the Parliament's prorogued, his narrative as people versus Parliament. People have no respect for Parliament. He's demonstrating that what is in effect an attempt to reinforce democracy, in their view, is actually a battle to thwart the will of the people. So bring on a general election is his view. If he has to resign and go into opposition for a short period of time, that merely burnishes his reputation, whilst a Corbyn temporary government extends. But the Achilles heel with them is they have no plan B. They're not united on what to do with this extension time, leaving an open field for Boris Johnson.
So, Claire Fox, is Peter Wilding right that perhaps by doing this, by what would seem to be gambling, by pushing for a general election, he might actually snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat?
Well, it certainly is a gamble, but I think it's right that Peter draws attention to a hidden player in all of this, and that's the electorate. Because we've got into this situation precisely because whilst the majority of people voted in goodwill in 2016 to leave the European Union, since then, every attempt has been made, and I mean great attempts, the most convoluted pushing of constitutional parliamentary democracy to prevent that happening. And that is seen very much so as going against what ordinary people want. And it's led to a democratic crisis. It's a seismic moment in British democracy if you have a parliament that refuses to enact what people voted for. So Boris Johnson got elected. I mean, we have to remember that the Conservative Party were the ones who prevented that happening in the first place. But Boris Johnson got elected, and he certainly talked the talk of fulfilling that promise to the British people, the majority of whom voted to leave the EU. There's now something of a mess. I appreciate that. I and many others would have wanted a general election because that would have at least allowed the electors to have their say in some capacity rather than watching it on, tearing their hair out in utter frustration. But I think that in the scale of things, it is true that Parliament has been totally discredited by the actions of the last few weeks. Not so much by Boris Johnson, and goodness knows I'm not a supporter of the Conservative Party or of Boris Johnson, but at least he has talked about enacting the popular democratic will. And that's very important. If you're going to have sovereignty, you need to have popular sovereignty, and the real authority of Parliament resides in the voters. It doesn't reside, it's not God-given, it's not from on high. It resides with those of us who fought long and hard for universal franchise.
Certainly, those who want another referendum are also saying we want to enact the popular sovereign will. We want another shot at this because conditions have changed. Would you accept that as well, that perhaps it's time for another referendum rather than a general election?
So the second referendum problem is that if you have a second referendum without enacting the first, it can only lead to a really serious disillusionment with the democratic process. Imagine knocking on the doors of people and looking in the eye and saying, this is the most important vote you'll ever have in a generation, which they already heard before. They wouldn't believe it, would they? They'd think that you were making fun of them. The second thing is that those calling for a second referendum have, by and large, said that they won't accept the verdict of that second referendum if people voted to leave again. So it just feels as though we're being forced to vote again, so we vote the correct way as told by the establishment.
Peter Wilding, the fact that Boris Johnson was standing next to the Irish leader, the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, and talking about this will be a fundamental failure in statecraft for both governments if this doesn't work out. I mean, many Irish are going, what the hell did we do? Why would it be our fundamental failure in statecraft? But the fact that this meeting happened and we're still not any clearer about what would happen with the backstop, what would happen with the Northern Ireland border, what does that mean right now? Are we still extremely fudgy on details, and are we potentially on the verge of catastrophe here?
Well, a game is now underway, and the game is that either Boris Johnson brings back a deal which passes the House of Commons, or he doesn't, and if he doesn't, he'll have to seek an extension. All opposition parties want him to have two failures to his name by the time a general election comes: failure to get a deal and failure to get out when he promised. The issue about Ireland is just part of this game. There is no compromise that the European Union is going to make in any substantive form that will please the right wing of the Conservative Party or the DUP. The tragedy we have here is that what people don't realise, and Claire referred to the establishment earlier on, curiously enough, I have a very different view as a former Conservative of what the establishment is. It is now governed principally by those who would like Britain to become a market state, to get out of the European Union so it is not affected by supranational regulation, and to be as closely aligned with the United States as possible to create a kind of an entrepreneurial Singapore on Thames. They've wanted this for 25 years. They're not going to give that up now. So talking about Leo Varadkar, we're not seeing the wood for the trees here. This is, sadly for Claire, a scenario where the nationalist right has essentially been directed by a globalized financial elite in order to achieve a conclusion, which is to get rid of the social democratic state we've had for 60, 70 years and to replace it with something more like Singapore. For that, they have to get out of the European Union as soon as possible.
Okay, and I'll get Claire to respond in a moment, but I want to ask you, Dominic, faced with the two options of Boris Johnson going to Brussels and getting an extension, or going to Brussels and striking a deal before October the 31st, which one's going to be easier? And secondly, why the hell should the EU compromise at all with this UK government right now?
So I think politically, I think both options are very difficult for him. I mean, he says that he wants a deal, but we all know that the obstacles to getting a deal are quite significant because of this sort of these intractable differences between the UK and the EU over this issue of the Irish backstop. But at the same time, because of what I said earlier, because of the law that's been put in place, no deal hasn't been taken off the table completely, but no deal on the 31st of October is quite hard to see that unless the EU refuses to grant the UK an extension. So that means that, you know, if to keep his promise of delivering Brexit do or die by the 31st of October, you can see why he's going to want to at least try to get a deal. And you know, if he brings that back to the House of Commons and they reject it, then so be it. But I find it very hard to see him breaking that promise on extension. And I think what Peter was saying earlier about possibly resigning and then allowing someone else to kind of dirty their hands with seeking that extension and then campaigning in opposition. I think the real question then, I think this might be something that Claire wants to come in on, is that the opposition parties have made a big gamble. They've assumed that by forcing Boris Johnson to, as they see it, break his promise of leaving the EU by the 31st of October, they think that the Conservative Party will then lose votes to the Brexit Party in any election that follows in, say, November, when we're still in the European Union. But the question then is, do the Brexit Party kind of go along with what the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats expect them to do? Do they actually blame Boris Johnson, or do they blame the MPs who passed this law that's tied his hands?
All good points, and we'll get Claire to address some of them. But Dominic, this is where we thank you. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. We're going to bring in Denis MacShane now. He's the UK's former EU minister, a former Labour MP, and author of Brexit, No Exit, How in the End Britain Won't Leave Europe. Denis, good to have you back on the program. 3 years ago, we spoke the day after the vote. You were not happy with the decision, and you felt all sorts of chaos would unfold. Do you feel I don't know, maybe not happily, but do you feel vindicated right now that all your fears seem to have materialized, Denis?
Well, not happy. It's been very bad for the country. We've lost a great deal of our economic wealth. There are more beggars in the streets of London, and I do a lot of work in France, Spain, and British people there are really frightened. Many of them are elderly. Their pensions have lost 30% of their value because of the devaluation. And to stay in those countries after a no deal or a hard Brexit, they've got to spend €100,000 a year on healthcare and old age care insurance. They haven't got that money. They'll have to come back to Britain. Actually, I did write a book in 2014 called Brexit, How Britain Will Leave Europe. So I wasn't surprised by the result. And I did say, I think, and I've said continually, that there's going to be just a lot of confusion, a lot of uncertainty. I have a new book, so I don't want to talk about my books, but a new book coming out in a month called Brexiternity. Brexit becomes an eternity because whatever happens, no deal, Mrs May's deal, a new Johnson's deal, a general election, a referendum, Brexit is going to weigh so heavily on the politics, economics, society of Britain that it's going to be a really pretty boring, miserable 10 years. And I wish all the elected politicians listening to this from the UK the best of luck, 'cause it ain't going to be much fun.
Well, you said boring, miserable 10 years. It's not been so boring looking at it from the outside. In Claire Fox, you have a laundry list of things to respond to over the past 5 minutes. Take your pick.
Well, first of all, I wanted to respond to a comment that was made about how this was really an attempt by a globalised financial elite to bring Singaporean nationalist, money men to run the UK. And I really reject that. There will undoubtedly be some people who think like that, but the globalised financial elite, as based in the UK, are the ones who actually argued to remain in the European Union. One of the things that was extraordinary in the referendum was the way that the leading banks, the major international multinational corporates, all of the people who kind of ran society all rallied round arguing to remain within the European Union. So if I think there's a neoliberal bloc that's trying to curtail economic development in Europe, then I think it's the EU, not those of us who want to leave it. But the point about leaving, which gets us onto today's politics, is that voting for national sovereignty, voting to use the slogan that was used to take back control, gives an opportunity for us to argue over and determine our own future politically. So there will be no doubt major political arguments about whether it's a left-right or left or right or social democratic future, what have you. But those are things which then the British people can decide. That's the point of having national sovereignty. And I think that on the question then about what will happen in an election, if there is one, I think that the one thing we can't underestimate is the mess and confusion that the Labour Party is in this country, because it has now more or less come out as a Remain party. It will gain some seats and some votes as a consequence of that, but it's very much seen as having abandoned its Labour Leave voters, northern working class voters, who will actually be looking around to see who to vote for. And I was asked whether the Brexit Party will split the Leave vote in a general election. Indeed, the Brexit Party has made great pains to say to the Conservative Party that there should be a non-aggression pact in any general election, and that actually we should divide up some of those seats. And certainly the Labour seats, Labour heartlands, they're more likely to vote, voters are more likely to vote for the Brexit Party than they are for the Conservatives because of historical reasons of hating the Tories.
Okay, let's get Denis's response. He's shaking his head in disagreement.
Only very simply, UKIP, now called the Brexit Party, it's always a Nigel Farage personal property, always gets anti-European votes, anti-immigrant votes.
Very different.
It's been
Denis.
constant. Claire, look, I didn't interrupt you.
It's not anti-immigrant.
Anti-immigrant. Claire, I did not interrupt you. If you want to keep interrupting me, fine. UKIP and Nigel Farage get the anti-European, anti-immigration votes. Everybody agrees that was how 2016 was won. But when Nigel Farage puts himself up to be elected as a Member of Parliament 7 times, he's rejected completely. Because people love to vote for somebody who wants to give Brussels a kicking and immigration a kicking. But my goodness, you wouldn't trust Nigel Farage with your children's future, with tax policy, with policing on the streets. And so I think that we'll find if we get to an election, I don't think the Tories are going to allow themselves to be infiltrated and taken over by extreme people from Brexit, revolutionary communists and the right-wingers and the anti-immigration people. I think they'll find as an independent party as they should. What will happen, I don't know. I've got my other theories,
Right.
various people sort of discuss them. I think there's a lot still to play for. Just round one of this autumn opera over Brexit is finished.
Right.
But believe me, there's acts 2, 3, 4 and 5 yet to come in the next few weeks.
Right. Peter Wilding, I was going to get into who the elitists are. Is it your guys or Claire's lot? But, you know, you guys are going to fundamentally disagree on that. So I've changed my mind. Let me rather ask you, since you're sitting there in Brussels as well, what should the Europeans do right now? They see all of this swirling around in the UK. It's a big mess in UK Parliament. Boris Johnson trying to put out a bunch of fires at the same time. France threatening to veto a possible extension. What do the power brokers in the corridors of power in the European Union do right now?
They do nothing. I mean, they have their agreement. The European Union is an organization which, unlike many organizations, is based on the rule of law. And I just want to make one anecdote at the nub of my story here, why the Europeans should do nothing, is because what you're seeing here is a battle between two different ways of doing political business. A former Belgian ambassador once said to me, "You Brits, you come into the negotiating room and saying, I've got a carpet, you've got a kettle, let's do business." The politics of the souk, if you like. And we've got to where we are now in Britain because that mentality is prevalent throughout the Conservative Party for sure. You know, a party made of garagists, small businessmen. They get their deals done by negotiation. What the Conservative Party has never understood is that the European Union is different than that. It's a rule-based organization. Its purpose, though Claire will disagree, is essentially to spread democracy, freedom and the rule of law around the whole continent of Europe and unite it with the single market. And it has done that. A British achievement, I will have you know, single market and extension to uniting the whole continent. But what we have now is a battle between that type of political organization and Brexit Britain, buccaneering market state, looking for profits, dodging and weaving here and there. It's a totally different way of doing business. And so the Europeans are looking at this as a continent surrounded by a ring of fire. You've got Russia, you've got North Africa, you've got Trump, and you've got Brexit Britain. 4 polities that are seeking to get away from what many consider an old system, but with 70 years peace and prosperity behind it, a successful system.
Right. Claire, would you accept your Prime Minister coming back with a Brexit light over the next 6 weeks or so? Something that's heavily tilted in favor of the EU, but is still Brexit in name.
No, but it's Brexit in name only, as you've just pointed out. And I think I've never been somebody who thought that we shouldn't have tried to get a deal. And if in good faith a deal had been attempted to be negotiated by Theresa May's government, then we would have looked at it. But I think the present Theresa May version, which is a treaty that we can't get out of and has got all sorts of pitfalls that both Remainers and Leavers both criticise very heavily, then I think that wouldn't work now. So I think we do need a clean break Brexit. The thing that I did want to say, and I think it is important, which is, regardless of what all of us here think about the EU, the main thing is that the British people did vote on it. And they voted in good faith, thinking that they were leaving this institution. And some will continue to say it's a wonderful institution for peace and harmony and democracy. But if they respect democracy, they have to respect that democratically people voted to leave it. And by the way, 1/3 of the ethnic minorities in this country voted to leave the European Union.
I just want to get
that anybody who voted leave is an anti-immigrant. I just think it's a slur, though. It's very important for me as an anti-racist campaigner to not just take that as though it's a fact, because it isn't.
Noted. Denis MacShane, we have 45 seconds left on the program. Do you still believe, very briefly, that if it was put to a referendum again, that the people would choose to remain with the EU?
I think they'd vote for their best interest. It would depend on the campaign and whether finally the truth was told. I'm not sure. I'm nervous for a second referendum. I don't see anything else that cuts the Guardian knot. If not, if not, please read my book, Brexiternity. We'll be having this debate for another 10 years at least, unless somehow we have the leadership and the ability, and frankly, I'll put this offer to Claire, have a second referendum, trust the people, and if you win, Claire, you've won, we're out, we're isolated, we're a very different Britain. If I win, please work cooperatively for a decent and fair
Okay, well, you know what we'll do? We'll continue that conversation the next time we have this discussion on the Newsmakers, because we're out of time. I do disagree with you about the boring thing, because Parliament has been suspended for 5 weeks. I tell you, people are going to have to go back to Netflix for their entertainment now, everybody, unfortunately. Listen, we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. That's it for me on the Newsmakers. Thanks so much for joining us. Check out our full shows and other content on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Until next time, I thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.